twisted love triangle, sibling rivalry that turned deadly, criminal story. For Claire and Hannah, life had always been predictable, peaceful, and relatively simple. Growing up in a small, tight-knit suburban neighborhood, they had always known the comfort of routine. Their childhood was marked by laughter-filled evenings at the dinner table, shared secrets under the covers late at night, and an unspoken but deep bond between them that seemed impenetrable. Claire, the older of the two, was the more outgoing, the one who took the lead in their adventures, while Hannah, the younger sister, often played the quiet observer. But in their hearts, they shared everything, the kind of closeness only siblings who have grown up in each other's shadows can understand. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Their family was a model of stability. Their parents, both university professors, were devoted to their careers and to their daughters. The household was always filled with books in every room, on every shelf, and a constant supply of fresh ones being delivered each month. There was something almost idyllic about their upbringing, something that made them feel safe, almost untouchable. Their parents were loving and structured, providing the kind of discipline that balanced perfectly with affection. There were no secrets, no hidden resentments, at least none that the girls knew about. For Claire, this environment had always felt like the perfect foundation to build her future. From a young age, she exhibited a natural charisma that made her a favorite among her peers. She was the kind of girl who could walk into any room and immediately make people feel at ease with her bright smile and infectious laugh. She had a magnetic personality that drew people to her, and it didn't hurt that she was undeniably beautiful, with flowing brown hair and warm hazel eyes that sparkled with life. At 25, Claire had it all, or so it seemed. She worked at a small independent bookstore in town, a job that allowed her to indulge in her love of literature while still maintaining a quiet but independent life. She lived in a modest but cozy apartment, decorated with soft pastels and vibrant plants, and she enjoyed a steady relationship with Mark, a local graphic designer she had met at a mutual friend's party a year earlier. Mark was kind and easygoing, with dark hair that framed his sharp, handsome features. His sense of humor was one of the things Claire loved most about him. He was clever and quick-witted, and he made her laugh in a way no one else could. Their relationship had grown quickly, and after months of dating, Claire had begun to think that Mark might be the one she would spend the rest of her life with. Mark was everything Claire had hoped for: attentive, loving, and emotionally available. They enjoyed their time together, often spending weekends visiting local museums or taking long walks in the park, discussing everything from their favorite books to their plans for the future. Claire had begun to picture a life with him, perhaps a small house by the lake, maybe even children one day. They made sense as a couple. There was an ease to their dynamic, a shared sense of adventure, and the feeling that they both understood each other deeply. But beneath Claire's contentment, there was an unspoken tension, a complication that had always existed, but which Claire had never really addressed. Her sister, Hannah, had always been the quieter one, the one who preferred to observe rather than participate in the social circles Claire moved through so easily. Hannah was not shy, but she was introspective. Her world was inward, filled with thoughts and ideas that she rarely shared with others. From an early age, she had been more of a listener than a talker, a deep thinker who felt more comfortable in solitude than in large groups. She loved to read as much as Claire did, but her interests were often different. While Claire devoured romance novels and contemporary fiction, Hannah was drawn to more obscure, philosophical works, those with dark themes and complicated characters. And yet, for all the differences in their personalities, Claire and Hannah had been inseparable for years. They had shared everything, from schoolyard secrets to dreams of their futures. Their bond was strong, unshakable, until Mark came into the picture. At first, Claire had no reason to suspect that her sister might harbor any deeper feelings for Mark. After all, they had always been close, and Claire never imagined that anything could come between them. When she first introduced Mark to Hannah, she had noticed that Hannah seemed reserved, even distant, but Claire attributed it to her sister's general introversion. She assumed it was simply a case of Hannah being unsure about the new addition to their circle, as she had always been a little slow to warm to new people. But as time went on, Claire began to notice a subtle change in Hannah. It wasn't overt, but there were moments, small glances, long silences, that suggested something more. Claire would catch her sister staring at Mark when he wasn't looking, or hear a faint hint of jealousy in her voice when she talked about him. It was nothing too obvious, just little things, almost imperceptible, but enough for Claire to begin to wonder if there was something going on that she didn't understand. As the months passed, Claire's relationship with Mark grew stronger. She had begun to envision a future with him, even started to fantasize about marriage. It was during this time that Claire realized something about her sister that she had never fully acknowledged before, the kind of quiet, unspoken resentment that had always simmered beneath the surface. When Claire got engaged to Mark, it felt like a natural progression, a culmination of everything they had shared. Claire was ecstatic, eager to plan their future together and imagine a life filled with love and laughter. But for Hannah, the news of Claire's engagement was a turning point. It wasn't the happiness of her sister that shook her. It was the realization that, once again, she was being left behind. From the moment Claire made her announcement, something inside Hannah snapped. She had never truly gotten over the fact that Mark had chosen Claire, and now, with the impending wedding, it felt as if she was being erased from the picture entirely. Hannah had always been the second one. Second in line for attention, second in line for approval, second in line for love. She loved her sister, but she also envied her in a way she couldn't express. Claire had always been the radiant one, the one who effortlessly drew people in, while Hannah remained on the sidelines, watching from a distance. And now, even the man she had secretly harbored feelings for had chosen her sister over her. The pain of it was unbearable. But despite this intense emotional turmoil, Hannah kept her feelings hidden. She could never let Claire know how much she hurt, how much she resented her for having everything. Hannah didn't know how to articulate the depth of her feelings. She didn't know how to explain that it wasn't just about Mark, but about everything. The way Claire's life seemed to unfold so easily, while Hannah struggled to find her place in the world. The way Claire was loved, admired, and sought after by everyone she met, while Hannah often felt invisible, unnoticed, and unimportant. Even as she kept these feelings buried deep inside, they began to take root, growing stronger and more complicated with every passing day. The resentment became an ever-present undercurrent in her interactions with Claire. At family gatherings, she would smile through clenched teeth as she watched Claire and Mark laugh together, never once allowing herself to show how deeply it hurt. She would nod along as Claire made wedding plans, all the while feeling like she was sinking into an abyss. Every conversation with her sister became a reminder of what she could never have. There were moments, fleeting and infrequent, when Claire would catch a glimpse of something in her sister's eyes, a shadow, perhaps, or a flicker of something darker that she didn't fully understand. But Claire always brushed it off, attributing it to her sister's quiet nature. After all, they had always been different. But what Claire didn't realize was that her sister was not just quietly brooding over Mark's engagement. Hannah was slowly being consumed by something darker, something that Claire could never have anticipated. The days before the wedding passed in a blur of busy preparations and family gatherings. Claire was swept up in the excitement, planning every detail of the wedding with Mark, envisioning their life together. Meanwhile, Hannah withdrew further into herself, a storm building within her that she refused to acknowledge, even to herself. She felt as though the ground beneath her was slipping away, that everything she had once known was being slowly taken from her. She began to question everything she thought she knew about herself and about her sister. Would this marriage mark the final fracture in their relationship? Would it push her over the edge? As the day of the wedding approached, the weight of her unspoken feelings became too much to bear. What started as a quiet resentment had morphed into something far darker, far more dangerous. The quiet comfort of their childhood was slipping away, and something far more destructive was taking its place. Claire and Hannah's lives, once intertwined in the most beautiful of ways, were now on the cusp of unraveling. Hannah's jealousy of Claire's relationship with Mark didn't develop overnight. It had started in the smallest, most subtle of ways, like a slow drip of poison, imperceptible at first but gradually eroding something deep within her. At first, it was just the occasional twinge of envy, a feeling she could easily dismiss as natural. After all, it was perfectly normal for a younger sister to look up to her older sibling and admire her relationships. It was something she had grown up with, that quiet admiration. Claire, the confident and outgoing one, had always been the center of attention, the one who everyone loved, the one whose presence seemed to make every room brighter. Meanwhile, Hannah had often felt like the shadow, the one who was unnoticed unless someone was looking closely. But she had learned to accept it, to live with it. She wasn't the radiant, outgoing one, and that was fine, until Mark came into their lives. When Claire first introduced Mark to Hannah, there had been no overt signs of attraction. At least, not at first. Mark had been charming, polite, and easygoing, like so many of the men Claire had dated before him. But there was something different about him. He wasn't just charming in a way that put people at ease. He was magnetic in a way that made people want to be around him. Mark had an effortless charisma that made him stand out in any crowd. And for Hannah, who had always struggled to stand out, it was like a knife twisting in a wound she hadn't even realized was there. It wasn't just that Mark was attractive, or that Claire seemed happy with him. There was something deeper, something more unsettling about it. It was the way Mark looked at Claire, with a kind of gaze that suggested she was the most important person in the world to him. It was the way he seemed to always know exactly what to say to make her laugh, or how he could reach across the table to touch her hand in such a natural, loving way. To Hannah, it felt as if Mark was the perfect fit for Claire, a person who was everything Hannah wasn't, outgoing, charismatic, effortlessly loved by everyone. Hannah wasn't foolish. She knew that her feelings were complicated. She had never thought of Claire as a rival, never even considered the idea that her sister could somehow take something from her. But Mark was different. In the quiet recesses of her heart, she had always harbored a secret desire for him, something she couldn't shake, something that had only grown stronger the longer she saw him around. She had never told Claire, never let on that there was a part of her that had fallen for him. 2. How could she? Mark was Claire's boyfriend, and it would be unthinkable to betray her sister in that way. But as much as she tried to bury the feelings, they refused to go away. At first, she told herself that it was just a passing infatuation. It was normal to be attracted to someone Claire was dating, wasn't it? People were attracted to their friends' boyfriends all the time, weren't they? Hannah tried to brush it off as something fleeting, a momentary lapse in judgment. But as Claire's relationship with Mark grew more serious, Hannah began to realize that her feelings were more than just passing. They were becoming something deeper, something darker, and the jealousy began to gnaw at her with an intensity she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just that Claire and Mark seemed perfect together, though they did. It was the realization that Mark had chosen Claire. Mark, the charming, easygoing man who everyone liked, had chosen her sister and not her. And that, more than anything, hurt. It was a reminder of something that had haunted Hannah for years, that she was always second in line, always in her sister's shadow, never quite able to step into the spotlight. The turning point came one evening when Claire invited Mark over for dinner at their parents' house. It was supposed to be a casual get-together, but something about that night felt different to Hannah. Maybe it was because she had been feeling increasingly isolated, or maybe it was because she had started to sense the finality of Claire's relationship with Mark. But when Claire walked into the kitchen, smiling and chatting with Mark as if everything was perfect, it was like a switch flipped in Hannah's mind. She had always known that Claire's happiness was important. She had always supported her sister in everything, even when it hurt. But now, the idea of Claire getting married, of her starting a life with Mark, felt like a betrayal. Hannah realized, with a shock that left her breathless, that she was no longer just a quiet observer in her sister's life. She was an outsider, looking in. And the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the final straw. Mark, the man who had been the center of her fantasies for years, was now planning a future with Claire. The idea of it filled her with rage, a cold, bitter kind of anger that she had never allowed herself to feel before. She wanted to hate Mark. She wanted to blame him for coming into their lives and destroying the fragile equilibrium they had always shared. But she couldn't. The truth was, she hated herself. She hated herself for allowing this feeling to grow, for letting it fester into something that she knew could never be fixed. How could she explain it? How could she tell Claire that the man she was about to marry was the same man Hannah had secretly loved from the moment they had met? And so, the jealousy began to consume her. It wasn't just about Mark anymore, it was about everything. The years of living in Claire's shadow, the endless comparisons, the constant feeling of being overlooked and ignored, it all came crashing down. The anger Hannah felt was not just about losing Mark, but about losing everything that had ever made her feel worthy. She wasn't just the sister who didn't get the man, she was the one who didn't get the life Claire had. The announcement of Claire's engagement only made things worse. It was a day that should have been filled with joy, with the happiness of a sister sharing her future plans with her family. But for Hannah, it was the day she realized that she would never be able to outrun her feelings. The jealousy, the anger, the bitterness, it all became too much to carry. She couldn't look at Claire without feeling the ache in her chest, the gnawing desire to have what she could never have. Claire was overjoyed, of course. She had always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, and now it seemed as if all her dreams were coming true. Mark had proposed in the most romantic way imaginable, and now they were planning their future together. For Claire, everything was perfect. But for Hannah, everything felt like a lie. She smiled and congratulated her sister, but inside, she was drowning. She had always been the one to support Claire, to stand by her side through every decision, every challenge. But now, Hannah felt invisible. She felt like a bystander in her own life, someone who was watching as everything she had ever wanted slipped further and further away. As the weeks passed, the reality of Claire's engagement set in. Mark and Claire began making plans for their wedding, and every conversation seemed to revolve around the future they were building together. Claire would come over to their parents' house with excited updates about venues, dresses, and flower arrangements, and Hannah would sit quietly, pretending to be happy for her sister, pretending that nothing was wrong. But the truth was, everything was wrong. The more Claire talked about her wedding, the more Hannah wanted to scream, to tell her that she couldn't go through with it, that she couldn't let Mark be with Claire. The pressure of holding in her feelings, of maintaining the facade of the supportive sister, began to wear on her. She knew she couldn't keep pretending forever. The emotional distance between her and Claire grew wider with each passing day, and the resentment inside her festered, turning into something darker, something she could no longer control. The longing for Mark that had started as a secret crush had transformed into something dangerous, a desire that had now fused with the jealousy and bitterness that had been building up for years. By the time of the engagement party, Hannah had already decided that she couldn't take it anymore. Claire and Mark's happiness felt like an insult to her, a reminder of everything she would never have. The world, it seemed, had always been in Claire's favor. And now, with the wedding on the horizon, Hannah had to face the unbearable truth. She would never be the one. The quiet, unspoken resentment that had been brewing for months finally reached a tipping point. What had started as a quiet desire had become a torrent of rage that she could no longer suppress. She wasn't just angry at Mark for choosing Claire. She was angry at herself for allowing this to happen, for allowing herself to fall into a trap of jealousy and resentment she had no way of escaping. And so, it was with that bitter, desperate feeling in her chest that Hannah began to make plans of her own, plans that, in her mind, might just undo everything that was happening to her, everything she couldn't control. Hannah's world, once grounded in the security of her family and the quiet but predictable rhythm of daily life, was beginning to unravel. The jealousy that had quietly simmered beneath the surface of her interactions with Claire for months was now manifesting in an explosive way. She could no longer pretend that she was okay with Claire and Mark's relationship. The more she tried to suppress her feelings, the stronger and more volatile they became. Hannah felt like she was caught in an emotional storm, pulled in one direction by the desire to protect the fragile bond she shared with her sister, and pulled in another by an overwhelming urge to destroy everything that stood between her and the man she had secretly loved for so long. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. This was about years of feeling invisible, second, overlooked. And now, Claire had everything. She was about to marry the man Hannah had spent countless sleepless nights dreaming about, and Hannah could not bear to be relegated to the sidelines any longer. This wasn't something she could run away from anymore. No, this was the moment of reckoning, the moment when everything would change. It all started when Claire casually mentioned that she and Mark were going to spend the weekend at a cottage by the lake. Just a little getaway before the wedding, Claire had said, her voice light, her smile radiant with the kind of happiness that stung Hannah's heart. It was a simple statement, a seemingly innocent one, but to Hannah, it was the final straw. Claire's life was moving forward with a promise of love and adventure, while Hannah's was stagnating in a mire of bitterness and longing. There was no longer any illusion that things would return to normal. It felt as if her entire world was slipping through her fingers, and every minute that passed only deepened the sense of loss. As Claire continued to share her plans, Hannah had listened without saying a word. But her mind was already racing, already calculating how she could change things. She couldn't let them go on like this, couldn't allow her sister to sail away into a blissful future while she drowned in the painful reality of being left behind. The fact that Claire was so unaware of her sister's feelings, so oblivious to the depth of the emotional turmoil Hannah was experiencing, only fueled her sense of injustice. It wasn't fair. None of it was. And for the first time in her life, Hannah began to feel an overwhelming sense of entitlement, a belief that she deserved something too, something that had always been out of reach. When she stood in the kitchen that night, washing dishes while Claire chattered away about the wedding plans, it was as if a switch flipped. Hannah knew what she had to do. She knew that she had to take control. But control over what? She had no idea. All she knew was that this was her chance. Her chance to make her feelings known, her chance to take action. Hannah wasn't sure exactly what would happen next, but the desire to stop her sister's happiness had become an insatiable fire. It began small, just a passing remark to Mark. A joke about the wedding. "You're sure you want to marry Claire?" she'd said with a smirk, her tone light but edged with something else. Mark had laughed it off, not taking her seriously. After all, who would? But for Hannah, it was a way to test the waters, to gauge his response, to see if there was a sliver of doubt, something she could latch onto. When Mark responded with nothing more than a chuckle and an affectionate glance at Claire, she felt the weight of her desire for him even more acutely. Her heart twisted, knowing that Mark would never look at her the way he looked at Claire. But then, in the quiet moments when she was alone with herself, something dark began to take root. She could feel the desperation creeping into her thoughts. Maybe it wasn't just about Mark anymore. Maybe it was about reclaiming something that she felt had always been taken from her. The life Claire had, the attention, the love. These things were no longer just things to admire from afar. They had become things that Hannah believed were rightfully hers. And the more she thought about it, the more she resented Claire for not seeing it, for not understanding just how much her own life had been a series of sacrifices for her sister's happiness. It was in these moments of isolation, in the depths of her mind, that the idea began to solidify. If she couldn't have Mark, if she couldn't have the love she so desperately longed for, then she would have to destroy the very thing that stood in her way. She would have to tear down what Claire had built. She wasn't going to just be a passive observer anymore. She was going to be an active participant in the story of their lives, and in a way that no one would see coming. One evening, after a long day of pretending to be the supportive sister at yet another wedding planning meeting with Claire, Hannah had an idea. It was both simple and diabolical. She wasn't sure how it had come to her, but in the dark of the night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, it seemed to make perfect sense. If she couldn't have Mark, then she would ensure Claire couldn't keep him. Maybe, if she could somehow break their engagement, force Mark to see the reality of what their relationship truly was, then Claire would understand. Then Claire would see just how deep Hannah's feelings ran, how much she had been pushed aside, and perhaps, just perhaps, Mark would see her in a new light. It was a horrifying thought, one that she didn't fully understand, but she couldn't shake it. And once the seed was planted, it began to grow. There were moments of clarity in between her moments of madness. She would stop herself and try to reason with her thoughts, telling herself it wasn't right, that she didn't want to destroy her sister's happiness. But those moments of doubt never lasted long. The idea would return to her mind, stronger than ever, and she would return to the plan. Every piece of her body felt like it was being pulled into a dark vortex, a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. Days passed, and her actions became more deliberate. She found herself seeking out moments to be alone with Mark. At first, she pretended it was innocent, casual conversation, just two people talking, nothing more. But her mind was always working, always calculating the next move. Every time she found herself alone with him, her pulse would race, a mixture of excitement and dread settling deep in her stomach. She was treading dangerous waters, and she knew it. She was walking a tightrope between desire and sanity, between hope and despair. And as she watched Claire smile at Mark from across the room, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The turning point came one night during a small gathering at the house. Claire and Mark had invited a few friends over to discuss the wedding details. It was a warm evening, the kind where laughter flowed easily and the atmosphere was light. Claire was in her element, talking excitedly about the future, about the life she and Mark would build together. Hannah, however, was sinking deeper into herself. Every word Claire spoke seemed like a reminder of everything Hannah would never have. And then, Mark turned to her. "You know," he said casually, "Claire's always been so lucky to have you around. You're like her rock." His words, meant as a compliment, struck Hannah like a slap in the face. He didn't know what it cost her to be Claire's rock. He didn't understand the weight of the sacrifices she had made in silence, all while Claire basked in the glow of her happiness. In that moment, the calm, collected version of Hannah cracked. She felt her heart begin to race. The anger, the jealousy, the need to be seen, to be heard, everything boiled over. "I'm glad you think that," Hannah said, her voice surprisingly steady, even though her insides were churning. "But sometimes I wonder what it would be like if it was me, you know? If it was me with someone who made me feel special." Her words hung in the air, a challenge disguised as a casual remark. Mark, oblivious, smiled at her. "Well, you deserve someone amazing, too." Hannah met his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes locked. A wave of cold reality washed over her. She wasn't just fighting for Mark's attention anymore. She was fighting for her own sense of worth. In that moment, she was no longer the supportive sister or the quiet observer. She had crossed a line, and she wasn't sure she could go back. This was it, the moment she would act. Hannah knew that she had made the decision. She had entered the unknown, the space where her actions would no longer be in her control. She had taken the first step into a world where she would need to break all ties, no longer the obedient sister or the passive bystander. The familiar had dissolved, and in its place, there was only the unknown, filled with the dangerous thrill of what was to come. The days after Hannah's decision to confront the tangled emotions she had long suppressed passed in a blur. She was no longer the woman she had been just a few weeks ago. That version of herself, quiet, reserved, the faithful sister always playing the supportive role, had all but disappeared. Now, she was someone else entirely, someone who had crossed a line, someone whose heart had grown heavy with desire, resentment, and a thirst for something more. Hannah didn't know who this new version of herself was, but she couldn't stop the momentum she had built. It was like a boulder rolling downhill, gaining speed with every day that passed. Her interactions with Claire, once effortless, became strained. She could feel the distance between them widening, like an invisible chasm that she couldn't quite explain. Claire remained blissfully unaware of the emotional war raging inside her younger sister. She was preoccupied with her wedding plans, her life with Mark. Her joy was so palpable, so contagious, that it made Hannah's isolation feel even more acute. At times, it almost felt like Claire was living in a dream, one that had no room for her. That thought, the idea that Claire's happiness, her future, was taking shape without any consideration for her younger sister, gnawed at Hannah's insides like a slow-burning fire. Hannah had no idea how far she was willing to go to disrupt that future, but she knew that she had to start somewhere. So, she began to change her tactics. Her earlier attempts to directly confront Mark about his relationship with Claire had not produced the kind of reaction she had hoped for. Mark had been polite, even kind, but he had brushed off her comments as harmless teasing. It was clear that Mark didn't view her the way she wanted him to, and that realization stung more than she cared to admit. But it wasn't about Mark, not entirely. She had to stop thinking of this as a romantic rivalry and start viewing it as something more fundamental. This was about power. This was about taking back control over her life, about proving to herself that she could shape her own destiny, no matter the cost. So, she began to focus on Claire. Hannah knew that the foundation of Claire's relationship with Mark was built on a sense of trust, one that had been forged over months of love, laughter, and shared moments. If she was going to tear that foundation down, she would need to approach it strategically. The more she observed Claire, the more she realized that her sister's life was one of perfection, a carefully constructed image of happiness and security. But like all things that seemed perfect on the surface, cracks had started to form. Hannah had always been observant. It was a skill she had cultivated over the years, a quiet attentiveness that allowed her to see things that others missed. She had noticed small details, moments that seemed insignificant to everyone else but were, in fact, crucial to her plan. Claire had always been a little too trusting, a little too eager to share her most intimate thoughts with those around her. It was a flaw, one that Hannah intended to exploit. There were moments when Claire would confide in her, moments when the two of them would sit together and talk about the wedding, about their childhood, about the future. It was in these moments that Hannah found her opportunity. She began to plant seeds of doubt, small comments disguised as sisterly concern, but they were laced with the venom of envy. "Do you ever wonder, Claire," she asked one evening as they sat together in their parents' living room, "what it would be like if Mark didn't love you as much as you thought? I mean, how well do you really know him?" Claire had paused for a moment, her smile faltering just a little, but then she had brushed it off with a laugh. "You worry too much. I'm sure of Mark. He's the one for me, Hannah." But that brief moment of hesitation had not gone unnoticed by Hannah. It had been a crack in the facade. Just a tiny one, but enough for her to start prying. Over the next few weeks, she pushed a little harder, always in ways that seemed innocuous, harmless. She knew that Claire had no reason to suspect her, that everything she said would be taken as nothing more than a sisterly concern. And that was precisely what made it so dangerous. Hannah didn't just want to make Claire doubt Mark's devotion to her. She needed to make her doubt herself. Claire had always been so confident, so sure of her place in the world. For years, she had been the shining star, the one who everyone admired, the one who was always the center of attention. But now, that confidence was becoming a liability. Hannah had always been in her shadow, but now, she wanted Claire to feel what it was like to be uncertain, to feel a flicker of doubt creeping in, just as Hannah had always felt. She started paying attention to Mark's behavior as well. When he came over to the house, Hannah would study his reactions to things, looking for any sign of weakness, any hint of discontent in his relationship with Claire. She would catch him in moments when he seemed distant, when a smile didn't quite reach his eyes, or when his gaze lingered just a fraction too long on her. Hannah couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope when these moments occurred. It was as if the universe was giving her a sign that maybe, just maybe, Mark was starting to notice her. But the truth was, she wasn't sure what she was looking for. Was she looking for proof that Mark didn't love Claire? Or was she simply trying to justify her own obsession, to find a way to make her feelings seem valid? She wasn't sure anymore. Every time she thought she had a clear path, another layer of doubt would cloud her judgment. The lines between right and wrong began to blur. One evening, as she was waiting for Mark to pick Claire up for a dinner date, Hannah found herself alone with him in the hallway. They had exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. But this time, Mark didn't leave immediately. Instead, he paused, glancing at Hannah with a slight hesitation in his eyes. "You're really something, you know that," he said, his voice low. "Always looking out for Claire. It's admirable." The comment was innocent enough, but for Hannah, it felt like a moment of recognition. She had waited for this, waited for Mark to notice her in some way. His words were flattering, and for a brief moment, she imagined what it would be like if he saw her differently, if he saw her as something more than Claire's younger sister. The thought made her heart race. But before she could say anything, Claire's voice echoed from the kitchen, and Mark immediately turned to go. "I'll see you later, Hannah," he said, a casual smile on his lips. It was a fleeting moment, but to Hannah, it felt significant. Something had shifted. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that the door was now slightly ajar. Over the following days, she continued to push. Every small, calculated comment she made had an effect. Claire began to grow more distant, more uncertain. She would check her phone more frequently, as though waiting for messages from Mark, and sometimes, when she spoke of him, there was a trace of uncertainty in her voice that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, so subtle that Claire herself may not have noticed it, but to Hannah, it was a victory. She was succeeding. The more she pushed Claire, the more she saw the cracks in her sister's relationship with Mark. It was as if the very act of planting doubt in Claire's mind had begun to infect every aspect of their lives. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't something that happened overnight. But over time, the seeds of uncertainty Hannah had sown began to bear fruit. Claire and Mark's relationship, once seemingly unshakable, was now filled with small moments of tension, moments that had always existed but were now amplified by the subtle doubt that had been introduced. Hannah had succeeded in making her sister question the one thing that had once seemed unbreakable, her trust in Mark. But Hannah also knew that this was just the beginning. She had started something, but it wasn't enough yet. There was still more work to be done. There were still more cracks to expose. And so, she adapted. She became more deliberate in her actions, more strategic in her approach. She was no longer just a passive observer in their lives. She was a player, and she would stop at nothing to achieve her goal. For weeks, Hannah had been carefully constructing a web of doubt, planting seeds of suspicion in Claire's mind with subtle words, casual comments, and moments of quiet manipulation. She had watched, waited, and calculated every move. And now, as the day of Claire and Mark's engagement party approached, the cracks in their relationship were undeniable. Mark was different. His smiles were more forced, his eyes less warm when he looked at Claire. Their once easy affection had turned brittle, frail, as though they were both walking on eggshells, unsure of what was real anymore. For Hannah, it was a triumph, an undeniable confirmation that her efforts had borne fruit. Claire, ever the optimist, never suspected a thing. She still trusted her sister, still confided in her, and continued to bask in the glow of her upcoming wedding plans. But it was clear now to Hannah that the foundation of Claire's relationship with Mark was on the verge of collapse. This was the moment she had worked for, the moment she had longed for. She had succeeded. She had created the crack in Claire's perfect world, and now she could finally claim the victory she had so desperately craved. The engagement party arrived, and with it, the tension that had been building between Claire and Mark came to a head. The atmosphere at the party was unusually stiff. The guests, excited for the upcoming wedding, couldn't help but notice the undercurrent of discomfort between the happy couple. Claire's smile was forced, Mark's laugh a little too loud. Everyone around them seemed to sense the unease, though no one dared to speak of it. Hannah, however, noticed every shift in body language, every moment when Claire's eyes darted nervously to Mark, or when Mark's gaze lingered a little too long on her. It was almost as though they were both aware of the tension but didn't know how to address it. It was the perfect storm, and Hannah reveled in it. She watched as Claire tried to play the role of the carefree bride-to-be, but the cracks were evident. Mark was distant, distracted, and Hannah could see that the more time passed, the more this distance between them grew. She had done it. Her plan had worked. Claire was no longer the confident, radiant woman she had once been. She was unraveling, bit by bit, and Hannah's heart swelled with something like victory. But it wasn't the satisfaction she had imagined. There was no elation in seeing Claire's pain, no sense of triumph in the realization that Mark was no longer as enamored with her sister as he had once been. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness. Hannah had believed that if she could just break this relationship, if she could force Claire to feel the same insecurity and doubt that had tormented her for years, then she would finally feel validated. But now that she had achieved it, she found herself confronted with an uncomfortable truth. This victory was meaningless. At the party, Claire and Mark stood on opposite sides of the room, exchanging only polite, strained words when forced to do so. Claire was speaking to their parents, smiling through gritted teeth, her gaze flitting anxiously toward Mark every so often. Mark, on the other hand, had withdrawn into himself. He was surrounded by friends, but his eyes kept wandering to the door, to the window, as though he were waiting for something or someone. Hannah couldn't tear her eyes away from him. It was a sight that made her stomach turn. She couldn't look away. Mark wasn't looking for Claire. No, his eyes sought something else, something beyond the room, beyond the party. Perhaps he was already regretting his decision to propose to Claire. Perhaps he was regretting everything. For a brief moment, Hannah allowed herself to believe that he was looking at her, that his wandering gaze might have been drawn to her in the way she had always hoped. But she was lying to herself. Mark wasn't looking at her. He wasn't even really looking at Claire. He was lost in his own thoughts, adrift in a sea of doubt. It was then that Claire approached him, the weight of her hesitation palpable in the air between them. She had finally worked up the courage to speak to him, but her words were careful, measured. "Mark, we need to talk," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough for Hannah to hear from across the room. Her sister was trying to hold it together, but the vulnerability in her eyes was unmistakable. She wasn't just worried about the wedding anymore. She was worried about the future that was slipping through her fingers as the tension between her and Mark grew. Hannah's pulse quickened. She had orchestrated this. She had made this happen, and now that it was unfolding before her eyes, she felt no joy. She had wanted this to play out, to see Claire suffer as she had suffered, but as she watched her sister stand there, her hands trembling, her voice quiet with fear, Hannah realized the depth of the damage she had caused. This wasn't just a fight between two people. It was the unraveling of something fragile and beautiful. For the first time, Hannah saw the situation for what it truly was. This wasn't a victory at all. It was destruction. The false security she had created for herself by tearing apart Claire's world was nothing more than an illusion. Mark's eyes, so distant and vacant, were a reflection of the emotional cost of her actions. His disillusionment was not a prize. It was a sign that everything had gone wrong. As the evening wore on, Claire and Mark retreated to a quiet corner, their voices low but intense. Hannah couldn't hear the words, but the body language between them spoke volumes. Mark was angry, frustrated, while Claire was pleading, desperately trying to salvage the relationship she had once believed would carry her into the future. Watching them, Hannah realized that the bond between them, however fragile, was something that couldn't be so easily broken. No matter how much she had wanted to tear it down, it wasn't her place to destroy something that, in the end, had nothing to do with her. The moment of victory, the moment when she had anticipated the collapse of her sister's happiness, had turned sour. Hannah could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The satisfaction she had once felt in seeing Claire falter was now replaced by a gnawing emptiness. She had succeeded, yes, but at what cost? It was at that moment that Mark turned toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly as they met hers. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes was enough. There was something in his gaze that made Hannah's stomach churn. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse, disappointment. For the first time, Hannah realized that she wasn't just alienating Claire, she was alienating herself. She was becoming someone unrecognizable, someone who had sacrificed her own integrity, her own values, in pursuit of a hollow goal. Her manipulation had worked, but it had cost her more than she had anticipated. It had destroyed the person she had once been. As the evening drew to a close, Claire and Mark left together, the silence between them as deafening as the tension that had hung in the air all night. Claire didn't look back. Hannah stood alone in the crowd, watching them go. She had done it. She had broken the relationship. But now, she wasn't sure what she had gained. She had achieved her goal, but it felt like nothing more than a hollow victory. There was no joy in it, no sense of accomplishment. There was only a growing realization that the thing she had wanted most was not the thing she needed. In her pursuit of revenge, in her desire to prove that she could control the narrative, she had lost sight of the fact that her actions were never truly about Mark or Claire. They were about her own deep, unresolved pain. As the last of the guests filed out of the party, Hannah stood at the window, watching the car carrying Claire and Mark disappear into the night. She had broken their world, but now her own was beginning to crack as well. The question that lingered in her mind was no longer about how to destroy Claire's happiness. It was about how to rebuild her own. In the days that followed the engagement party, Hannah could not escape the gnawing feeling of unease that had taken root deep within her. The hollow satisfaction she had initially felt, watching the carefully constructed world of Claire and Mark unravel before her, had dissipated into something far worse: guilt. A deep, unshakable guilt. What she had imagined would be a moment of triumph now felt like a weight she couldn't lift, no matter how hard she tried. The once small cracks in Claire's and Mark's relationship had become fissures. They were no longer a couple preparing for a wedding. They were two people on the brink of something far darker. Mark had withdrawn even further, and Claire, though still trying to cling to the belief that their relationship could be salvaged, had become shadow of the woman she had been before. Her bright, radiant optimism had dimmed, replaced by something far less hopeful, a deep, visceral anxiety. Hannah had known that her actions would have consequences, but she had never imagined that they would feel so suffocating. She had told herself that Claire's pain, Claire's confusion, was all part of the process. After all, it had been Claire's life she was disrupting, the perfect, idyllic world that Hannah had always resented. Yet now that she saw the toll it was taking on her sister, she was beginning to question whether the price she had paid for her own twisted satisfaction was worth it. The first real wake-up call came when Claire came to her. It was late at night, and Hannah had just finished cleaning up after dinner when the doorbell rang. At first, she didn't recognize the knock. It was urgent, frantic, yet hesitant. When she opened the door, there was Claire, standing on the threshold, looking smaller than Hannah had ever seen her. Her eyes were bloodshot, her cheeks tear-streaked, and for the first time, Hannah saw a vulnerability in her sister that was too raw, too painful to ignore. "I need to talk to you," Claire said, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. Without waiting for an invitation, Claire stepped inside. She didn't ask for a drink, didn't even offer a smile. She simply sat on the couch and let the silence hang in the air between them like a suffocating cloud. For a long moment, Hannah stood by the door, unsure of what to say. She had expected Claire to be angry. She had expected accusations, perhaps a demand for an explanation of the strange behavior that had marked their relationship in recent weeks. But what she had not anticipated was the look of raw, broken desperation on Claire's face. "I don't know what to do anymore, Hannah," Claire finally whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what's happened to Mark. He's not the man I thought he was. He's distant, and he doesn't seem to care about our future anymore. I've tried everything I can think of to fix it, but nothing is working." She paused and looked up at her sister, her eyes wide and searching, almost pleading.
"I'm scared, Hannah."
"I'm scared that I've lost him." For the first time, Hannah felt a tremor of regret deep within her chest. The words Claire spoke were the very thing she had wanted to hear, not as a vindication, but as proof that her plan had worked. But now, with Claire sitting there, breaking apart in front of her, all of Hannah's carefully constructed walls came crashing down. What had she done? "I don't know what's happening between us anymore," Claire continued, tears welling in her eyes. "I know I've been distant, but I don't know what to do. I'm scared that he doesn't love me anymore, that it's all falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Hannah swallowed hard. She knew she should say something, anything, to offer comfort, to act like the sister she had once been. But instead, all she could feel was the heaviness in her chest, the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her. Claire's pain was her doing. Every inch of it was the result of the seeds of doubt she had so carefully planted. For the first time, Hannah realized the extent of her actions. She had thought that if she could only break the relationship, if she could only make Mark doubt Claire's worth, then everything would fall into place. She had imagined that, with Claire's happiness shattered, she would somehow be able to claim the life she had always wanted, a life where she was the one who was seen, the one who was loved, the one who mattered. But in the pursuit of that selfish desire, she had caused irreparable harm to the one person who had always stood by her, Claire. "I don't know what to say," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. She sat down next to Claire, her hands trembling. The distance between them was more than physical. It was emotional, a vast chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. "I don't know what's happened either." For the first time in years, Hannah wasn't sure who she was anymore. The person she had been, the one who had longed for affection, for validation, for attention, she had become someone else entirely. A stranger, a manipulator, someone who could break apart her sister's world without a second thought. Claire sniffled, wiping her eyes. "You've always been there for me, Hannah. But now it feels like you're not even the same person. You've been different lately, and I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can fix this." Hannah could only sit in silence, unable to offer any comforting words. She had broken everything: the trust, the bond, the love they had once shared. She had sacrificed it all for what? A hollow victory that had left her with nothing but emptiness? She had thought she wanted to see Claire's world fall apart, but now that it was happening, it felt like a disaster she couldn't control. "I never meant for it to be like this," Hannah finally murmured, though it sounded more like an apology to herself than to Claire. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. This was no longer about Mark. It wasn't about Claire's happiness or her own jealousy. It was about something much darker. She had been so consumed by her own need for validation, her own bitterness, that she had become the very thing she had always despised. A destroyer of what was good and pure. Claire sat there for a long time, silent tears streaking down her face. Neither sister knew what to say next. The air between them was thick with regret and fear, a silence that felt impossible to break. In the following days, the emotional weight of Hannah's actions continued to haunt her. The guilt consumed her every waking moment. It wasn't enough to know she had broken Claire and Mark apart. She was now facing the reality that her manipulations had pushed her sister to the brink of despair. She had no idea how to fix what she had broken. The consequences of her actions were so much larger than she had anticipated. It was only after a sleepless night, when she couldn't escape the crushing weight of her remorse, that she understood the true price of her desire. The worst part wasn't the alienation from Mark or the conflict with Claire. It was the realization that she had destroyed the very thing she had always wanted: the closeness, the bond, the love she once shared with her sister. In her pursuit of happiness, she had torn apart the one connection that had always made her feel whole. She had become the villain in her own story, and now she was left with the aftermath: a life built on lies, broken relationships, and a future that seemed unbearably bleak. It had been weeks since the engagement party, and the aftermath had been far more devastating than Hannah could have imagined. The fallout from her actions had left her emotionally wrecked, and she had seen firsthand how destructive her jealousy and desire for attention had been. Claire, once a sister with whom she had shared everything, was now someone she could barely look in the eye. Their relationship, what remained of it, was fractured beyond repair. Claire had cut herself off, retreating into a silence that spoke volumes. Hannah had tried, in her own way, to reach out, but the damage she had caused was irreversible. The reality was that Hannah had never truly understood what it would cost to tear down the walls of Claire's life, her happiness. It had seemed like a necessary evil at the time. The feeling of superiority, of having control, had been intoxicating. Yet now, in the solitude of her apartment, surrounded by nothing but her own thoughts, she felt nothing but emptiness. Each day she awoke to the weight of her mistakes, her manipulations, the cruel things she had done and said, the way she had so casually destroyed the very things she had once envied. The person she had been before, the sister who had quietly supported Claire, the person who longed for affection but was too afraid to admit it, seemed so far removed from the person she had become. The Hannah who had walked into the engagement party that night, smug with the knowledge that she had orchestrated Claire's destruction, no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone else entirely, someone who now saw the horror in the mirror. The first few days after Claire's visit were the hardest. Claire had left, not with anger or accusations, but with a quiet resignation. She hadn't said it, but Hannah knew Claire had already made up her mind. She had lost all faith in her. The trust that had once been unspoken between them was gone. It wasn't just Claire who had changed, it was Hannah, too. She had gone from being the sister who would do anything for her to someone who had allowed her own bitter desires to destroy everything. Now, Hannah sat in the same living room where they had once laughed together, shared secrets, and made promises. The silence felt deafening. The emptiness was suffocating. She had wanted so desperately for things to be different, for her life to feel more meaningful, for people to finally pay attention to her. But the price she had paid for that attention had been too high. She had traded her integrity for the fleeting satisfaction of revenge. And in doing so, she had alienated the one person who had always mattered most. The weeks stretched on, each one more painful than the last. Hannah found herself revisiting memories of her childhood with Claire, times when they had played together in the backyard, their laughter echoing under the warm summer sun. It felt like a lifetime ago, a time when their bond had been unbreakable, a time when Claire had always been there for her, and she had always been there for Claire. How had it all unraveled so quickly? One evening, after weeks of soul-searching, Hannah could no longer sit in silence. The weight of her guilt was unbearable. She needed to see Claire, needed to at least try to repair the irreparable. With trembling hands, she dialed the number she had avoided for weeks, the number she had called countless times, but never answered. The call rang out, and for a moment, Hannah thought Claire might not pick up. But then, as though fate had decided to give her one last chance, the line clicked. "Hello." Claire's voice was distant, cold. "Hannah." Claire's tone was cautious, but there was no warmth in it, only a quiet distance that sent a pang through Hannah's chest. I need to talk to you," Hannah stammered. She hadn't rehearsed this moment, hadn't known what she would say, but she knew it had to happen. "Can I come over? Please." There was a long pause. Hannah's heart raced as she waited, knowing that the woman on the other end of the line had every reason to shut her out. But after what felt like an eternity, Claire's voice came through, softer now.
Okay.
"But just for a little while. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you." The words hit her like a slap, but she knew they were deserved. She had destroyed something precious, something that couldn't just be fixed by a few kind words or an apology. But this, at least, was a beginning. Hannah didn't know what to expect when she arrived at Claire's apartment. She hadn't seen her sister in weeks, and the tension between them felt like an insurmountable wall. Claire opened the door, but didn't smile. The woman who had once been her confidant, her closest ally, now seemed like a stranger. There was no embrace, no warmth in the way Claire looked at her. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that things could never go back to the way they were. They sat on the couch in silence for a long time, the only sound the occasional shuffling of footsteps in the hall. Then, finally, Hannah spoke, her voice small but steady. "I'm sorry," she said. The words felt like a stone in her mouth, heavy and awkward. "I'm so sorry, Claire.
For everything.
For what I did to you, to Mark. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt you." Claire didn't look at her at first, but the silence between them felt different now, not like a chasm, but a space that might one day be bridged. When Claire finally spoke, her voice was tight, but there was a vulnerability in it that made Hannah's heart ache. "You did hurt me, Hannah. More than I ever thought you could. You took something from me, something that can't ever be fixed. I trusted you, and you." She paused, shaking her head. "I don't even know who you are anymore." The words cut deep, but Hannah didn't flinch. She deserved them. She had spent so much time blaming everyone else, Mark, her family, Claire, for the pain in her life, but she had never stopped to look at herself. Now, facing the wreckage of her own making, she realized the one truth that had always been missing. She was the only one to blame. "I know," she said softly. "I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right if I can." There was another long silence, but this time, it wasn't as suffocating. The anger that Claire had once felt had ebbed, replaced by a deep, painful sorrow. She had loved her sister once, loved her enough to trust her with everything. But that trust had been broken, and Claire knew that it could never be completely repaired. Hannah wasn't asking for forgiveness. She didn't have the right to. She wasn't even asking Claire to return to the sister she had been. She knew that everything had changed, that trust, once shattered, was not easily rebuilt. What she wanted, what she needed, was simply this: to acknowledge the damage she had done and to bear the weight of it. "Can we ever go back to being close again?" Hannah asked, her voice small. Claire took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, her eyes softened just a little. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I did before. But I don't want to hate you, Hannah. I don't want this to be the end for us." The road to redemption was long. Hannah knew that it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope, just a small one, that, maybe over time, things could heal. Not completely, not perfectly, but perhaps in time, she could rebuild the relationship she had destroyed. As she left Claire's apartment, Hannah felt lighter. Not free. There was no freedom in what she had done, but there was a sense of clarity, a sense of truth that she hadn't had before. She understood now the pursuit of her own desires had led her down a dark path, but that path was now behind her. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she had learned one important lesson: that true peace didn't come from tearing others down to raise yourself up. It came from facing your own mistakes, owning them, and trying to do better. Hannah had lost many things: her sister's trust, her sense of self, her belief in the power of affection. But she had also gained something far more valuable: the awareness that she had the power to change. And that, perhaps, was the first step toward healing, not just for her, but for everyone she had hurt along the way.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.